Hello, and welcome back to the Sleep Library.
I am your host, and tonight we're taking a quiet journey into one of history's most fascinating yet gentle traditions, the world of Victorian mourning customs, and the remarkable profession of the Victorian mourner. As we explore this topic together, allow yourself to settle in comfortably. Let the soft cadence of this story wash over you as we delve into a time when grief was an art form, when mourning was a carefully choreographed ritual, and when entire communities came together to honor the departed with elaborate, beautiful ceremonies. Tonight, we'll walk through the misty cobblestone streets of Victorian London, peek into the quiet parlours where families prepared for their final farewells, and meet the dedicated professionals who made their living by helping others grieve with dignity and grace. So close your eyes if you wish, breathe deeply, and let us begin our gentle exploration of this forgotten world. In the soft gaslight of a Victorian evening, as the London fog rolled gently through the narrow streets, there existed a world where mourning was not simply an emotion, but a carefully cultivated art form. The Victorian era, spanning from 1837 to 1901, brought with it an elaborate and beautiful approach to death and remembrance that would seem almost foreign to our modern sensibilities. Picture, if you will, a typical Victorian household on a quiet residential street. The windows are draped with heavy black crepe, their surfaces reflecting the muted light of the street lamps outside. Inside, family members move slowly through rooms that have been transformed into spaces of reverence and memory. This was not a hasty or chaotic response to loss, but rather a methodical, almost meditative approach to grief that honored both the deceased and the complex emotions of those left behind. The Victorians understood something that perhaps we have forgotten in our rush through modern life, that grief deserves time, space, and ritual. They created an entire ecosystem around mourning, complete with its own etiquette, fashion, traditions, and yes, even its own professionals.
These were not merely undertakers or clergy, but specialists in the delicate art of helping families navigate the complex social and emotional landscape of loss.
At the heart of this system were the professional mourners, men and women who dedicated their lives to the service of grief. Unlike the hired mourners of ancient civilizations who wailed and tore their clothing in dramatic displays, Victorian mourners operated with quiet dignity and subtle expertise. They understood that their role was not to steal attention from the genuine grievers, but rather to create a framework of support that allowed authentic emotion to unfold naturally. These professionals came from various walks of life, but they shared certain qualities that made them particularly suited to their calling. They possessed what the Victorians valued most highly: restraint, dignity, and an intuitive understanding of social propriety. A skilled Victorian mourner could read a room with the precision of a conductor reading a musical score, knowing exactly when to offer a gentle word of comfort, when to maintain respectful silence, and when to guide mourners through the intricate steps of funeral protocol. The profession attracted people who found meaning in service to others during life's most difficult moments.
Many were widows or widowers themselves, who had navigated the treacherous waters of Victorian mourning customs and discovered they had a gift for helping others do the same. Some were retired servants who had spent years observing the subtle dynamics of household management and social interaction. Others were simply individuals with naturally empathetic dispositions who found their calling in this most human of services. Training for this profession was largely informal, passed down through apprenticeship and careful observation. A new mourner might begin by assisting at smaller, less formal services, learning the countless details that made the difference between a service that comforted and one that caused additional distress.
They learned to walk at the proper pace, slow enough to convey solemnity, but not so slow as to make the procession drag interminably.
They mastered the art of the sympathetic nod, the gentle guidance of confused elderly relatives, and the tactful management of children who didn't fully understand the gravity of the occasion.
The economic aspect of professional mourning was handled with characteristic Victorian delicacy.
Families who could afford such services never spoke openly about the financial arrangements, which were typically handled through intermediaries such as funeral directors or family solicitors. The mourners themselves were paid modest but steady wages, and many found the work reliable enough to support themselves and their own families.
It was considered respectable employment, particularly for women who had limited options in the Victorian job market. What made Victorian professional mourners unique was their understanding that they were participating in something far more significant than a simple business transaction.
They were guardians of tradition, keepers of ritual, and facilitators of community healing.
In an era when extended families often lived far apart and social mobility meant that traditional support networks might not be available, professional mourners filled a crucial gap in the social fabric.
The mourner's day would begin long before the funeral service itself.
They would arrive at the family home while the household was still waking, their presence immediately transforming the atmosphere from one of grief to one of purposeful preparation. They moved through the house with quiet efficiency, ensuring that mirrors were properly covered with black cloth, that flowers were arranged in appropriate configurations, and that the countless details of Victorian mourning protocol were attended to. These details were not mere superstition or empty ritual. Each element served a psychological and social purpose. The covered mirrors prevented the grieving family from being startled by their own reflection, often made gaunt and unfamiliar by grief. The specific arrangements of flowers conveyed messages of remembrance and hope to visitors who might not know what words to offer. The careful attention to clothing, posture, and timing all worked together to create an environment where grief could be expressed safely within the bounds of social acceptability. As the mourning progressed, the professional mourners would guide family members through the process of receiving visitors who came to pay their respects. This was a delicate dance of social interaction, where the mourners served as subtle directors, ensuring that conversations remained appropriately subdued, that visitors didn't linger too long or leave too abruptly, and that the family's energy was preserved for the more demanding rituals that lay ahead. The beauty of the Victorian approach to professional mourning lay in its recognition that grief is both deeply personal and inherently social.
While each individual's pain was unique and private, the expression of that pain took place within a community context that required navigation and support.
Professional mourners served as bridges between these two realities, helping families honor their private feelings while participating in the public rituals that brought comfort and closure. As the morning light filtered gently through the heavy curtains of a Victorian home in mourning, a complex social hierarchy would begin to reveal itself. This was not a cruel or arbitrary system, but rather a carefully evolved structure that helped entire communities understand how to respond appropriately to loss. Like the layers of sediment in an ancient riverbed, Victorian mourning customs had accumulated over decades, creating a rich and nuanced landscape of ritual and responsibility.
At the pinnacle of this hierarchy sat the chief mourner, usually the widow or eldest son of the deceased.
This person carried the heaviest burden of grief, but also the greatest honor of representation. They were expected to embody the perfect balance of sorrow and dignity, showing enough emotion to demonstrate the depth of their loss, but maintaining sufficient composure to guide others through the mourning process.
It was a delicate performance that required both genuine feeling and considerable self-control. Supporting the chief mourner was an entire network of family members, each with their own specific role to play.
Immediate family members were expected to display visible signs of deep mourning for extended periods, often a full year for widows, 6 months for children and parents, and varying shorter periods for more distant relations.
These were not arbitrary timeframes, but carefully calibrated periods that acknowledged both the intensity of grief and the practical need for individuals to eventually re-enter normal social life.
The professional mourners fit seamlessly into this hierarchy, occupying a unique position that was both essential and nearly invisible. They were neither family members nor mere servants, but something in between, skilled practitioners who understood the emotional and social architecture of grief. Their presence allowed the actual family members to focus on their genuine emotions without worrying about the countless practical and protocol details that could easily overwhelm someone in the throes of loss. Within the profession itself, there existed its own subtle rankings. Senior mourners, often women who had been practicing the art for many years, commanded considerable respect and higher fees. They were typically assigned to the most prominent families or the most complex funeral arrangements. These experienced practitioners had developed an almost supernatural ability to anticipate needs before they arose, to diffuse potential conflicts with grace, and to orchestrate the elaborate choreography of Victorian funeral customs with seeming effortlessness. Junior mourners, often learning the profession under the guidance of their more experienced colleagues, were assigned simpler tasks, but no less important ones. They might be responsible for ensuring that children remained appropriately quiet and well behaved, for managing the constant flow of flowers and condolence messages, or for maintaining the various ritual elements that needed attention throughout the day. These younger practitioners learned their craft through careful observation and gradual assumption of responsibility. The most skilled professional mourners were those who could adapt seamlessly to the specific needs and social standing of each family they served. A mourner working with a wealthy merchant family would need to understand the particular expectations of mover-rich society, while one serving an old aristocratic family would need to navigate entirely different traditions and sensibilities. The best mourners became something like social chameleons, able to blend perfectly into whatever environment they entered while still maintaining their professional effectiveness. Geographic variations added another layer to the hierarchy of mourning. Professional mourners in London operated differently from their counterparts in rural villages or industrial towns. Urban mourners needed to understand the fast-paced, anonymous nature of city life, where neighbors might barely know each other and traditional community support systems had eroded. Rural mourners, by contrast, worked within tight-knit communities where everyone knew everyone else, and where the funeral of a prominent community member became a significant social event for the entire village. The seasonal rhythms of Victorian life also influenced the hierarchy of mourning. Deaths that occurred during the social season, roughly from November through July, when the upper classes were most active in London society, required different management than those that happened during the quiet summer months when many wealthy families retreated to their country estates. Professional mourners learned to adjust their services accordingly, understanding that a winter funeral in London society required a much more elaborate and carefully managed social response than a summer burial in the countryside. Class distinctions were woven throughout the mourning hierarchy, but not in ways that modern observers might expect. While wealthy families could certainly afford more elaborate mourning rituals and more professional mourners, the Victorian ideal of appropriate mourning meant that even the grandest families were expected to observe certain limits and maintain certain proprieties. A truly skilled professional mourner helped families navigate these complex social expectations, ensuring that their display of grief was seen as both genuine and properly restrained. The middle classes, perhaps more than any other group, relied heavily on professional mourners to help them achieve the correct tone for their funeral observances. Unlike the aristocracy, who had generations of family tradition to guide them, or the working classes, who often maintained simpler, more traditional approaches to death, the middle classes were navigating relatively new social territory. They had the resources to afford elaborate mourning customs, but lacked the inherited knowledge of how to manage them appropriately. Professional mourners working with middle-class families often found themselves serving as both practical assistants and social consultants. They would advise families on appropriate expenditures, help them understand which traditions were essential and which could be modified to suit their particular circumstances, and ensure that their mourning observances would be viewed favorably by their social peers. This was delicate work that required not only knowledge of mourning customs, but also a sophisticated understanding of middle-class social anxiety and aspiration. The religious dimensions of Victorian mourning added yet another layer to the hierarchy. Different denominations had their own traditions and expectations, and professional mourners needed to be conversant with the subtle variations between Anglican, Methodist, Catholic, and other religious approaches to death and burial. A mourner working with a high church Anglican family would need to understand ceremonial traditions that differed significantly from those expected by evangelical Protestants or Catholics. Some professional mourners specialized in serving particular religious communities, developing expertise in specific traditions and building reputations within those networks. Jewish families, for example, required mourners who understood the complexities of Jewish mourning law and custom, while Catholic families expected professionals who could work seamlessly with the elaborate ritual framework of Catholic funeral masses and burial rites. The hierarchy of grief also extended to the treatment of children within the mourning process. Victorian attitudes toward childhood and death were complex and sometimes contradictory. Children were seen as naturally innocent and therefore less capable of understanding death's full significance, but they were also viewed as more spiritually pure and thus closer to the divine realm that the deceased had entered. Professional mourners who worked with families that included children needed special skills in managing these young mourners, keeping them appropriately involved in the rituals while protecting them from becoming overwhelmed by emotions they might not yet be equipped to handle. As the day of preparation continued, this quiet hierarchy would become more and more apparent to careful observers. Each person in the household knew their role, understood their level of responsibility, and moved through the elaborate choreography of mourning with practiced precision. The professional mourners moved through this structure like skilled conductors, ensuring that every voice in the complex symphony of grief found its appropriate place and expression. In the pearly dawn hours of a Victorian funeral day, when the world outside still lay shrouded in the gentle embrace of early morning mist, the sacred work of preparation would begin in earnest. This was not merely the practical arrangement of flowers and the polishing of silver, though those tasks certainly had their place. Rather, it was the careful transformation of ordinary domestic space into something approaching the sacred, a temporary cathedral of memory and reverence that would serve as the launching point for the deceased's final earthly journey. The professional mourners understood that this transformation was both deeply symbolic and intensely practical. Every element that they arranged, every detail that they attended to, served multiple purposes in the complex ecosystem of Victorian grief. A properly prepared mourning environment could help family members feel supported and contained in their sorrow, could communicate appropriate messages to the stream of visitors who would come to pay their respects, and could create the sort of dignified, memorable setting that would bring comfort to the bereaved for years to come. The preparation began with the house itself. Professional mourners arrived carrying carefully packed cases containing the tools of their trade lengths of black crepe fabric in various weights and textures, black ribbons and bows, appropriate floral arrangements, or the materials to create them, and small but significant items like black bordered stationery, memorial cards, and the specialized implements used in various mourning rituals. The first task was always the windows. Each window in the front of the house needed to be draped with black crepe, but the manner of draping conveyed important information to passers-by. A house in deep mourning might have its windows completely obscured, creating an atmosphere of profound seclusion and grief. A family observing lighter mourning, perhaps for a distant relative or someone who had died after a long, well-lived life, might use less elaborate drapery, allowing more light to filter through while still maintaining the appropriate visual signals of loss. The professional mourners worked with quiet efficiency, their movements deliberate and respectful.
They understood that family members might be watching their work, and that the care and attention they displayed in these preparatory tasks would set the tone for everything that followed.
A mourner who handled the black crepe carelessly or seemed rushed in their arrangements would communicate a lack of reverence that could cast a shadow over the entire proceeding. Inside the house, the transformation was even more complete.
Mirrors throughout the home were covered with black cloth or turned toward the wall.
This tradition served both practical and spiritual purposes. It prevented a grieving family from being startled by their own reflection, often made gaunt and unfamiliar by sorrow, and it symbolically represented the temporary suspension of vanity and worldly concerns that grief demanded.
The parlor or front room, where the deceased would lie in state and where visitors would come to pay their respects, received the most elaborate attention.
Professional mourners would rearrange furniture to create appropriate circulation patterns for the steady stream of visitors who would come throughout the day. They needed to ensure that people could approach the casket respectfully, spend an appropriate amount of time in contemplation or prayer, and then move on without creating uncomfortable crowding or awkward encounters with other mourners.
Lighting was adjusted to create the proper atmosphere bright enough for visitors to navigate safely and to see the face of the deceased, but subdued enough to maintain the solemnity of the occasion.
The professional mourners often brought their own candles and specialized lamps, understanding that the quality and color of light could dramatically affect the emotional tone of the gathering. The floral arrangements required particular expertise. Different flowers carried specific meanings in the Victorian language of mourning, and a skilled professional mourner needed to understand these subtle communications. White flowers generally symbolized purity and innocence, making them appropriate for children or young adults. Purple flowers suggested dignity and honor, suitable for respected elders or community leaders. Red flowers were rarely used in mourning arrangements, as they were associated with passion and temporal concerns that seemed inappropriate in the face of eternal realities. The arrangement of these flowers was also significant.
Circular wreaths symbolized eternal life, with no beginning or end.
Crosses conveyed Christian faith and resurrection hope.
More elaborate arrangements might incorporate symbols specific to the deceased's life or profession, musical notes for a musician, books for a scholar, or tools for a craftsman.
The professional mourners worked with local florists to ensure that these arrangements were not only beautiful, but also symbolically appropriate and fresh enough to maintain their dignity throughout the long day of visitation. Food preparation, while not directly handled by the professional mourners, fell under their coordination.
Victorian mourning customs included elaborate traditions around feeding the steady stream of visitors who would come to pay their respects.
Light refreshments needed to be available throughout the day, but the food had to be appropriately subdued, nothing too colorful, too rich, or too celebratory. Professional mourners worked with household staff or local caterers to ensure that visitors could be properly welcomed and refreshed without creating an atmosphere that seemed inappropriately festive. The preparation of the family themselves was perhaps the most delicate aspect of the mourner's work. Each family member needed to be dressed appropriately for their role in the day's rituals, but the professional mourners understood that grief could make even simple tasks like choosing clothing feel overwhelming.
They would lay out appropriate garments, help with difficult fastenings or unfamiliar mourning jewelry, and ensure that everyone looked appropriately dignified without seeming overly concerned with their appearance. Children required special attention during preparation.
Professional mourners needed to help them understand what would happen during the day, prepare them for the sight of many sad adults, and ensure that they were dressed comfortably enough to maintain appropriate behavior through what could be a very long and emotionally demanding day. This often meant having backup clothing available for very young children, quiet toys or activities for moments when they might become restless, and strategies for managing their needs without disrupting the solemnity of the occasion. The deceased themselves required careful attention from the professional mourners. while the actual preparation of the body was typically handled by specialized undertakers. The mourners were responsible for the final presentation, ensuring that clothing was properly arranged, that hands were positioned appropriately, and that the overall appearance conveyed the peace and dignity that surviving family members would want to remember. This work required considerable emotional fortitude from the professional mourners. They needed to handle these intimate tasks with both technical competence and genuine reverence, understanding that their work would be forever associated in the minds of the bereaved with their final memories of their loved one. A professional mourner who seemed uncomfortable with or disrespectful toward the deceased would cause lasting pain to the surviving family.
Throughout all of these preparatory tasks, the professional mourners maintained an awareness of timing that was almost musical in its precision. They understood the natural rhythm of a mourning day, the early hours when family members were still gathering their emotional resources, the middle period when visitors would arrive in the greatest numbers, and the later hours when exhaustion and grief might make everyone more vulnerable to emotional overwhelm.
As the morning light grew stronger and the time for visitors approached, the professional mourners would make their final adjustments to the carefully arranged environment. They would check each detail one last time, ensure that everything was positioned for both beauty and practicality, and then step back to assume their nearly invisible but essential roles as facilitators and guides through the complex choreography of Victorian mourning.
The house now stood ready, transformed from an ordinary domestic space into something approaching the sacred, a temporary sanctuary where grief could be expressed safely within the supportive framework of community ritual and professional expertise. As the church bells in the distance chimed the morning hours, a remarkable phenomenon would begin to unfold throughout the Victorian neighbourhood.
Word of a death spread through the community with the quiet efficiency of water seeping through fertile soil, and with it came an almost instinctive response from friends, neighbours, acquaintances, and even strangers who understood their role in the greater symphony of communal mourning. The professional mourners, positioned strategically throughout the house, would witness this gentle orchestration of community support with the practiced eye of those who had seen it countless times before.
Yet even the most experienced among them never ceased to be moved by the inherent human goodness that death seemed to call forth from even the most ordinary of neighbourhoods. The first visitors typically arrived in the late morning hours, after the family had time to complete their immediate preparations, but early enough to demonstrate their eagerness to pay respects. These early callers were usually close friends or immediate neighbors, people whose presence would bring comfort rather than additional social strain to the grieving family. Professional mourners understood the delicate psychology of these early visits and positioned themselves to facilitate smooth interactions without calling attention to their own presence. A skilled professional mourner could read the emotional temperature of each visitor almost instantly. Some arrived with genuine grief of their own, having lost not just a neighbor, but a true friend or confidant. These visitors required gentle guidance toward opportunities to express their feelings, perhaps a few moments of private conversation with the chief mourner, or time to sit quietly beside the deceased in personal reflection. Other visitors came primarily from social obligation, understanding their duty to pay respects, but feeling uncertain about how to navigate the unfamiliar territory of a house in mourning. The mourners served as subtle translators between these different types of grief and different comfort levels with mortality. They might guide a deeply grieving friend toward the family member who most needed their particular comfort, while steering a more socially motivated visitor towards safer interactions that wouldn't drain the family's limited emotional resources.
This required not only social intuition, but also a sophisticated understanding of the complex web of relationships that existed within any established community.
Children from the neighborhood presented special challenges and opportunities.
Victorian attitudes toward childhood exposure to death were more accepting than modern sensibilities might expect, but still required careful management. Professional mourners would often find themselves explaining to curious young visitors what they were seeing, helping them understand appropriate behavior, and sometimes serving as intermediaries between children and the adult mourners who might be too overwhelmed to interact naturally with the young ones. The rhythm of visitation followed predictable patterns that experienced mourners could anticipate and prepare for.
The late morning and early afternoon hours typically brought the steadiest stream of visitors, as people completed their daily obligations and found time to make their respectful calls.
This was when the mourners' skills as crowd managers became most evident, as they worked to ensure smooth traffic flow through the house, prevent bottlenecks that might create awkward situations, and maintain the appropriate atmosphere of reverent quiet despite the presence of many people. Religious visitors often came bearing specific gifts of comfort, perhaps a favorite psalm copied in beautiful handwriting, a small devotional book, or flowers chosen for their spiritual symbolism. Professional mourners learned to recognize these offerings and help ensure they received appropriate acknowledgement and placement. A skilled mourner might notice that a particular religious token held special meaning for the family and position it prominently, or conversely, might tactfully minimize displays that seemed inappropriate to the family's particular denominational preferences. The local clergy, when they came to make their pastoral calls, required particularly careful attention from the professional mourners. These visits served important functions beyond simple condolence. They were often when final arrangements for the funeral service were confirmed, when special requests or concerns were discussed, and when the spiritual preparation for the actual burial ceremony began in earnest. Professional mourners needed to ensure that these conversations could take place with appropriate privacy and that any practical matters raised by the clergy were promptly addressed. Business associates and professional colleagues of the deceased presented another category of visitor that required special handling. These individuals might feel genuine grief, but were often more concerned with practical matters, outstanding business obligations, professional responsibilities that needed to be transferred, or financial concerns that required immediate attention. Professional mourners learned to recognize these visitors and could often facilitate brief, discreet conversations that addressed necessary business without seeming to intrude upon the family's grief.
Servants and household staff from other homes in the neighborhood often came to pay their respects, particularly if the deceased had been known as a fair and kind employer.
These visits carried their own social complexities, as class distinctions needed to be maintained even in the face of shared grief. Professional mourners helped navigate these interactions, ensuring that working-class mourners felt welcome and heard while maintaining the social boundaries that Victorian society expected. The steady flow of condolence messages, flowers, and small gifts required constant attention and organization. Professional mourners often found themselves serving as informal secretaries, keeping careful records of who had visited, what they had brought, and what their specific relationship to the deceased had been. This information would prove invaluable later when the family needed to write thank you notes and when they wanted to record the specific kindnesses that had been shown during their time of loss. Food gifts presented both opportunities and challenges. Victorian mourning customs included strong traditions around feeding visitors and supporting the grieving family with prepared meals, but the constant arrival of casseroles, baked goods, and other offerings could quickly overwhelm even a well-organized household. Professional mourners coordinated with kitchen staff to ensure that food gifts were appropriately received, properly stored, and distributed fairly among the many visitors who would need refreshment throughout the day. The afternoon hours often brought more formal visitors, perhaps local dignitaries, prominent community members, or business leaders who came to pay their respects to a deceased person of standing. These visits required different management skills from the professional mourners, who needed to ensure that such visitors received appropriate recognition while not allowing their prominence to overshadow the more intimate grief of family members and close friends. Weather played a significant role in the pattern of visitation. On pleasant days, visitors might linger longer,
perhaps gathering in small groups outside the house to continue conversations about their memories of the deceased.
Rainy or cold weather compressed the visits, bringing larger numbers of people into the house simultaneously and requiring more active crowd management from the professional mourners.
As evening approached, the character of the visits would shift once again. Late visitors were often those who couldn't get away from work or family obligations earlier in the day, and they frequently brought a different energy, perhaps more hurried, more focused, but sometimes more emotionally intense for having been delayed in paying their respects. Throughout this entire orchestra of community response, the professional mourners maintained their nearly invisible presence, facilitating connections, managing logistics, and ensuring that the natural human impulse to support one another in times of loss could express itself as smoothly and meaningfully as possible. They understood that they were witnessing something far more significant than a social ritual. They were helping to maintain the vital bonds that held communities together through both celebration and sorrow.
As the day wound toward evening and the last visitors made their quiet departures, the house would settle into a different kind of quiet, not the empty silence that might have existed without this outpouring of community support, but the rich,
full quiet of a space that had been thoroughly blessed by the presence of many caring hearts. As twilight began to settle over the Victorian household, painting the windows with soft shades of amber and rose, a different kind of ritual would begin to unfold.
This was the intimate choreography of consolation, the delicate dance between those who grieved and those who sought to comfort them. Professional mourners understood that this was perhaps the most crucial aspect of their work, requiring not just social skill, but genuine emotional intelligence and an almost intuitive understanding of human nature in its most vulnerable state. The art of Victorian consolation was far more complex than modern observers might imagine. It involved a sophisticated understanding of the different types of grief, the various stages of emotional processing, and the subtle ways that comfort could be offered without seeming intrusive or inappropriate. Professional mourners spent years developing these skills, learning through careful observation and gradual experience how to read the emotional landscape of a household in mourning. Each family member required a different approach to consolation. The widow, if she was the chief mourner, might need support that acknowledged her new and frightening independence, while honoring her deep attachment to her deceased husband.
Adult children might struggle with guilt over things left unsaid or undone, requiring comfort that helped them process these complex emotions without becoming overwhelmed by regret.
Elderly parents who had lost an adult child might need consolation that helped them understand this unnatural reversal of expected life order. Professional mourners learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated what type of comfort each person most needed.
Some mourners found solace in talking about their memories of the deceased, requiring listeners who could encourage these reminiscences without becoming uncomfortable with emotional displays. Others preferred quiet companionship, needing the simple presence of someone who wouldn't expect conversation or emotional sharing. Still others found comfort in practical activity, wanting to stay busy with funeral preparations or household tasks rather than sitting with their grief.
The language of Victorian consolation was highly stylized, following established patterns that had evolved over generations. Professional mourners became fluent in this specialized vocabulary, knowing which phrases would bring comfort and which might inadvertently cause pain. They learned to speak of the deceased as having passed on or gone to their reward rather than simply died, using language that emphasized continuation rather than ending. They knew how to reference religious beliefs about afterlife and reunion without seeming to minimize the reality of present loss.
Physical comfort was offered within carefully defined boundaries. Victorian mourning customs included specific traditions around appropriate touch and physical support.
Professional mourners might offer a gentle hand on the shoulder, a supportive arm during difficult moments, or help with practical tasks like arranging clothing or managing personal items. However, They needed to provide this physical comfort without overstepping social boundaries or making anyone uncomfortable with excessive familiarity. The timing of consolation was as important as its content. Professional mourners learned to recognize when someone was ready to receive comfort and when they needed to be left alone with their grief.
They understood that attempting to console someone who wasn't emotionally prepared to accept comfort could actually increase distress rather than relieving it.
This required patience and careful observation, watching for subtle cues that indicated openness to interaction.
Children in the household required specially adapted approaches to consolation.
Professional mourners needed to understand child development well enough to offer age-appropriate comfort without talking down to young people or overwhelming them with concepts they weren't ready to understand.
They might help children express their confusion through simple activities, encourage them to share memories of the deceased, or simply provide steady, calm adult presence during a time when the other adults in their lives were emotionally unavailable.
The professional mourners also served as bridges between different generations within the family.
Older relatives might have different approaches to grief and different expectations about appropriate mourning behavior than younger family members. The mourners could help facilitate understanding between these different perspectives, translating between generational approaches to loss and helping family members support each other despite their different styles of grieving. Religious consolation presented both opportunities and challenges. Many Victorian families found deep comfort in religious beliefs about death and afterlife, but professional mourners needed to be sensitive to the wide variety of religious perspectives they might encounter.
Some families maintained strong, conventional religious faith that made spiritual consolation readily acceptable. Others might be struggling with religious doubts that death had intensified, requiring more careful and indirect approaches to spiritual comfort.
The mourners learned to work seamlessly with clergy members when they made their pastoral calls, understanding how to create appropriate space for spiritual counseling while remaining available to assist with any practical needs that arose. They might help arrange private conversations between family members and religious advisors, or they might facilitate group prayer or scripture reading when the family desired such activities. Practical consolation often proved as important as emotional support.
Professional mourners understood that grief could make ordinary life tasks feel impossibly difficult, and they offered comfort through gentle assistance with daily necessities. They might help family members choose appropriate clothing, assist with correspondence, or coordinate with household staff to ensure that meals were prepared and basic household functions continued smoothly. The consolation of visitors also fell within the mourner's purview. Many people who came to pay their respects were themselves struggling with their own grief, their own mortality fears, or their own discomfort with death and funeral situations. Professional mourners learned to offer subtle comfort to these visitors, helping them feel more at ease in the unfamiliar environment of a house in mourning and guiding them toward interactions that would be mutually beneficial for them and the grieving family.
Evening brought different consolation needs than the busy daylight hours.
As the stream of visitors diminished and the household settled into quieter rhythms, family members often found themselves confronting their grief more directly. Professional mourners adjusted their approach accordingly, offering more intimate support to family members who might be experiencing delayed emotional reactions or struggling with the reality of their loss as the formal rituals wound down. The transition from the public aspects of mourning to the more private evening hours required delicate management.
Some family members might want to continue receiving visitors well into the evening, using social interaction as a way of avoiding solitary confrontation with their grief.
Others might reach a point of emotional exhaustion that required protection from further social demands. Professional mourners learn to recognize these different needs and help orchestrate appropriate transitions. Sleep presented particular challenges for grieving families. The combination of emotional exhaustion and stimulating grief could make normal rest patterns impossible. Professional mourners often found themselves providing practical support for family members who couldn't settle down for the night, perhaps helping with bedtime routines for children whose normal schedules had been disrupted, or ensuring that adults who were struggling with sleep had appropriate comfort measures available. The mourners understood that their work during these evening hours was often the most meaningful of their entire service. Away from the busy social interactions of the day, they could offer more personal, individualized support to family members who were beginning to process the reality of their loss. This was when their skills as consolers were most fully tested, and when their presence could make the greatest difference in helping families navigate the difficult transition from the formal rituals of mourning to the longer-term process of learning to live with loss. As the household gradually settled into the quiet rhythms of evening, the professional mourners would begin their own transition from the intensive support role they had played throughout the day to the more watchful, protective presence they would maintain through the night hours leading up to the funeral itself. In the quiet hours before dawn on the day of the funeral itself, as the professional mourners moved through their final preparations with the precision of skilled artisans, there existed an almost mathematical beauty to the elaborate system of Victorian memorial customs. Every element, from the precise timing of various ceremonies to the specific symbolism embedded in floral arrangements, followed patterns that had been refined over decades of practice into something approaching scientific precision. The Victorian approach to memorial was grounded in the belief that death deserved careful, deliberate attention, that the transition from life to whatever lay beyond was too significant to be handled casually or hastily. Professional mourners understood themselves to be guardians of this careful attention, ensuring that every detail of the memorial process received the consideration it deserved and contributed to the greater whole of honoring the deceased and comforting the bereaved. The timing of Victorian funeral ceremonies followed rhythms that balanced practical necessities with symbolic significance. The period between death and burial was carefully calculated to allow time for relatives to travel from distant locations, for proper preparation of the deceased and the funeral arrangements, and for the psychological processing that families needed before they could face the finality of burial. Professional mourners helped families navigate these timing considerations, understanding how to balance the practical pressure to proceed with arrangements against the emotional need for adequate preparation time. Different relationships to the deceased required different memorial timeframes. Immediate family members might need several days to adjust to their loss before they felt ready for the public ceremony of funeral and burial. More distant relatives or community members could often participate meaningfully with less advanced preparation. Professional mourners coordinated these different needs, ensuring that the funeral arrangements accommodated the varying requirements of different mourners while maintaining appropriate dignity and solemnity. The mathematical precision of Victorian mourning extended to the physical arrangements of the funeral ceremony itself. The seating in churches or other ceremony venues was arranged according to strict hierarchies that reflected both family relationships and social standing. Professional mourners needed to understand these complex social calculations and ensure that the seating arrangements communicated appropriate respect for family bonds while avoiding potential conflicts or hurt feelings. The procession to the cemetery followed its own geometric patterns, with the positioning of different mourners in the funeral cortege carefully calculated to reflect their relationship to the deceased. Immediate family members walked closest to the hearse, followed by other relatives in order of closeness, then friends, associates, and community members. Professional mourners helped orchestrate these processions, ensuring that everyone understood their proper place and that the visual symbolism of the procession appropriately honored both the deceased and the various mourners. Floral mathematics represented one of the most complex aspects of Victorian funeral customs. Different flowers carried specific meanings. Different arrangements conveyed particular messages. and the positioning of various floral tributes communicated subtle information about the relationships between the deceased and various mourners. Professional mourners needed to be fluent in this elaborate symbolic language, understanding how to coordinate floral displays that were both beautiful and symbolically appropriate. The quantity of flowers was as significant as their variety and arrangement. Too few flowers might suggest that the deceased was not sufficiently mourned or honored, while excessive displays could seem inappropriate or ostentatious. Professional mourners worked with families and florists to achieve the proper balance, creating floral arrangements that conveyed appropriate grief and honor without crossing the lines of Victorian propriety.
Color mathematics played a crucial role in these calculations.
White flowers symbolized purity and innocence, making them appropriate for children or young adults. Purple flowers suggested dignity and nobility, suitable for respected community leaders or family patriarchs. The careful gradation of colors within arrangements could communicate subtle messages about the deceased's character, achievements, and place in the community. The memorial cards and funeral stationery that accompanied Victorian funerals followed their own precise formulas.
The size of the cards, the quality of paper, the style of printing, and the specific language used all conveyed information about the family's social standing and their relationship to the deceased.
Professional mourners often assisted families in making these decisions, helping them navigate the complex social mathematics of Victorian memorial communication.
Religious considerations added another layer of mathematical complexity to Victorian funerals.
Different denominations had their own requirements for funeral services, their own traditions around memorial customs, and their own expectations about appropriate displays of grief and remembrance. Professional mourners needed to understand these various religious mathematics and help families coordinate their memorial plans with the specific requirements of their faith traditions. The economics of Victorian memorial followed predictable patterns that professional mourners learned to navigate with sensitivity.
Families wanted to honor their deceased loved ones appropriately, but they also needed to consider their financial resources and avoid expenditures that might create long-term hardship.
Professional mourners helped families make these difficult calculations, understanding how to achieve maximum memorial impact within reasonable financial constraints. Different social classes had their own memorial mathematics, with established patterns for appropriate funeral expenses relative to family income and social standing. Professional mourners understood these class-based expectations and helped families plan memorial services that would be seen as appropriately respectful within their particular social circle. This required not only understanding of memorial customs, but also sophisticated awareness of social dynamics and class expectations. The geographical mathematics of Victorian memorial accommodated the increasing mobility of Victorian society.
Families might be scattered across different cities or even different countries, requiring memorial arrangements that could accommodate varying travel times and different regional customs.
Professional mourners helped coordinate these complex logistical challenges while maintaining the appropriate dignity and timing of the memorial process. Seasonal considerations added another mathematical element to Victorian funeral planning. Deaths that occurred during winter required different logistical arrangements than those during summer months.
Weather patterns, agricultural cycles, and social seasons all influenced the optimal timing and arrangement of memorial services.
Professional mourners developed expertise in these seasonal calculations, understanding how to adapt memorial plans to environmental realities while maintaining appropriate memorial standards. The memorial mathematics of Victorian childhood death required special expertise from professional mourners. The loss of children challenged Victorian sensibilities about natural order and divine justice, requiring memorial approaches that could acknowledge the special tragedy of young death while still maintaining appropriate religious and social frameworks. Professional mourners learned to navigate these particularly sensitive memorial calculations with extra care and understanding. Memory mathematics represented the ultimate goal of all these elaborate calculations. Professional mourners understood that the precise attention to detail in Victorian memorial customs was ultimately designed to create lasting, comforting memories for the bereaved. Every element that they carefully arranged, every tradition that they helped families navigate, was intended to contribute to positive long-term recollections that would sustain mourners through the difficult months and years of grief that lay ahead. The professional mourners themselves became part of these memory mathematics, understanding that their own conduct and attention to detail would be remembered and associated with the funeral experience. A mourner who performed their duties with exceptional care and sensitivity might be remembered gratefully for years, while one who seemed careless or inappropriate could mar the entire memorial experience for the family involved. As the final preparations were completed and the time for the funeral ceremony approached, all of these mathematical elements would come together in a carefully orchestrated symphony of memorial tribute. The professional mourners, having spent hours or days calculating and arranging every detail, would step back and allow the memorial itself to unfold with the precision and beauty that their careful mathematics had made possible. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets of Victorian London, the moment would arrive for the grand pageantry of farewell to begin. This was not pageantry in the sense of entertainment or spectacle, but rather the solemn, dignified procession that would carry the deceased on their final earthly journey while providing the community with a shared ritual of closure and remembrance. The professional mourners understood that this procession represented the culmination of all their careful preparation. Every detail they had attended to, every arrangement they had made, every comfort they had provided would now come together in a public ceremony that needed to honor both the deceased and the complex web of relationships that surrounded them.
It was a moment that required both technical precision and deep emotional sensitivity. The preparation of the funeral cortege began in the early dawn hours, with professional mourners coordinating the arrival of horses, carriages, and the ornate hearse that would carry the deceased. Victorian funeral processions were elaborate affairs that required careful timing and coordination. The horses needed to be groomed to perfection, their manes braided with black ribbons, their harnesses polished to gleaming brightness.
The carriages required final cleaning and arrangement, with appropriate seating assignments that reflected both family hierarchy and practical considerations for the elderly or infirm mourners who would participate in the procession. The hearse itself was a marvel of Victorian craftsmanship and symbolism.
These ornate vehicles were decorated with elaborate carved motifs representing mortality, eternity, and resurrection hope.
Professional mourners ensured that the casket was properly secured and positioned within the hearse, that any floral arrangements were stable enough to survive the journey to the cemetery, and that the overall appearance conveyed the dignity and solemnity appropriate to the occasion. The order of the procession followed strict protocols that professional mourners had memorized through years of experience. The immediate family members would follow closest to the hearse, usually in closed carriages that provided them with privacy during this most difficult part of the funeral process. Extended family members, close friends, and community mourners would follow in order of their relationship to the deceased and their social standing within the community.
Children's participation in these processions required special consideration for professional mourners.
Victorian attitudes toward childhood exposure to death were more accepting than modern sensibilities. But young mourners still needed protection from becoming overwhelmed by the solemnity and finality of the funeral procession. Professional mourners might arrange for children to participate in the early part of the procession, but be quietly removed if they showed signs of distress or exhaustion.
The pace of the funeral procession was calculated to achieve multiple objectives simultaneously.
It needed to be slow enough to convey appropriate solemnity and respect, allowing community members along the route to pay their respects as the procession passed.
However, it could not be so slow as to become interminable for the mourners, particularly elderly family members who might find the emotional and physical demands of the procession challenging to sustain over extended periods.
Professional mourners walked alongside the procession, positioned strategically to assist family members who might need support, to manage any unexpected challenges that arose during the journey, and to ensure that the procession maintained its appropriate dignity and order. They carried smelling salts for mourners who might become faint, spare handkerchiefs for those overcome by emotion, and small tokens of comfort that could be quietly distributed to children or others who showed signs of distress.
The route to the cemetery was typically planned to pass through areas of the community where the deceased had lived, worked, or maintained significant relationships.
This allowed neighbors, business associates, and community members who were not participating directly in the funeral to observe the procession and pay their respects. Professional mourners helped coordinate these route decisions, understanding the symbolic importance of including significant locations while maintaining practical considerations about timing and logistics.
Weather considerations could dramatically affect funeral processions, and professional mourners needed to be prepared for various contingencies.
Rain required umbrellas and protective coverings for mourners, while extreme cold might necessitate additional blankets or heated carriage stones. Summer heat could make the slow pace of funeral processions particularly challenging for elderly mourners, requiring careful attention to hydration and shade. The arrival at the cemetery marked a transition from the public pageantry of the procession to the more intimate ceremony of committal and burial. Professional mourners helped orchestrate this transition, ensuring that family members were properly supported as they moved from the relative privacy of their carriages to the exposed vulnerability of standing beside an open grave. Cemetery protocols required their own specialized knowledge from professional mourners. Different cemeteries had varying regulations about funeral procedures, different facilities for mourners, and different traditions around burial ceremonies. Professional mourners who worked regularly in particular cemeteries developed relationships with cemetery staff and became familiar with the specific requirements and opportunities of different burial grounds. The graveside ceremony represented perhaps the most emotionally challenging part of the entire funeral process. Professional mourners understood that watching the casket being lowered into the ground could trigger intense emotional responses from family members who had managed to maintain their composure throughout the earlier portions of the funeral. They positioned themselves strategically to provide immediate support to anyone who might become overwhelmed by the finality of this moment. Religious ceremonies at the graveside varied significantly depending on denominational traditions and family preferences. Professional mourners learned to work seamlessly with clergy from different faith backgrounds, understanding the varying requirements for graveside prayers, readings, and rituals. They helped coordinate the practical aspects of these ceremonies while maintaining appropriate reverence for the spiritual elements. The tradition of throwing earth onto the casket presented particular challenges for professional mourners. This symbolic gesture of returning the deceased to the earth was deeply meaningful, but could also be deeply disturbing for some mourners. Professional mourners learned to gauge family members' emotional readiness for this ritual, and sometimes served as intermediaries, performing the gesture on behalf of mourners who found it too difficult to complete themselves. The departure from the cemetery required as much care and attention as the arrival. Family members who had maintained their emotional control throughout the funeral might finally break down once the burial ceremony was completed and the reality of their loss became undeniable. Professional mourners understood that their support was often most needed during these final moments of the funeral process, when the formal rituals ended and mourners faced the prospect of returning to daily life without their deceased loved one. Transportation arrangements for the return journey needed to accommodate mourners who might be in various states of emotional distress. Professional mourners helped ensure that family members were properly supported during the carriage ride home, that anyone who needed medical attention received it promptly, and that the transition from the public ceremony back to private grief was handled with appropriate sensitivity. The dispersal of the funeral procession marked the end of the public mourning rituals, but professional mourners understood that their work was not yet complete.
Family members would need continued support as they faced their first evening, their first night, and their first morning without the structure of funeral preparations to occupy their attention and emotional energy.
Some families chose to gather for a meal or reception following the funeral, providing an opportunity for extended family members and friends to share memories and continue the process of mutual comfort. Professional mourners helped coordinate these gatherings when they occurred, ensuring that the transition from the solemnity of the funeral to the more social atmosphere of a family gathering was managed appropriately. As the funeral day drew to a close and the elaborate pageantry of farewell came to an end, the professional mourners would begin their final task, helping families transition from the intensive focus of funeral preparations to the longer-term process of learning to live with their loss.
The pageantry was over, but the deeper work of mourning was just beginning.
In the quiet aftermath of the funeral ceremony, as the carriages rode slowly homeward through the familiar streets of the Victorian neighbourhood, a different kind of expertise was required from the professional mourners. The elaborate rituals and formal ceremonies had provided structure and meaning to the immediate crisis of death, but now came the more delicate work of helping families navigate the complex emotional landscape that stretched ahead of them in the weeks and months to come. Professional mourners understood that the period immediately following a funeral often brought unexpected emotional challenges.
Family members who had drawn strength from the busy preparations and the supportive presence of community during the funeral might find themselves feeling strangely empty and disoriented once the formal rituals were completed. The house, which had been filled with visitors and activity, would now seem unnaturally quiet. The sense of purpose that came with funeral arrangements would be replaced by the more difficult task of simply learning to live with loss.
The professional mourners had observed this pattern countless times, and they had developed sophisticated strategies for helping families through this transitional period.
They understood that grief was not a linear process that moved predictably from one stage to another, but rather a complex emotional experience that could shift unexpectedly from moment to moment. Someone who seemed to be coping well might suddenly be overcome by a wave of intense sorrow triggered by a familiar scent, a piece of music, or simply the sight of the deceased's empty chair.
Different family members required different approaches to emotional navigation during this period. Widows, particularly elderly women who had been married for many decades, often struggled with the most profound adjustments.
They faced not only the emotional reality of losing their life partner, but also practical challenges about managing household affairs, financial matters, and social relationships that their husbands had previously handled.
Professional mourners offered both emotional support and practical guidance, helping these women understand their options and make decisions at their own pace.
Adult children who had lost parents might experience complex mixtures of grief, relief, guilt, and anxiety about their own mortality.
Professional mourners learn to recognize these complicated emotional responses and provide comfort that acknowledge the full complexity of adult grief without trying to simplify or minimize the conflicting feelings involved.
They understood that adult children might need permission to feel relieved if a parent had suffered through a long illness, or might need help processing guilt about aspects of their relationship that could no longer be resolved.
The professional mourners also served as bridges between different family members who might be experiencing grief in very different ways. Some people found comfort in talking extensively about their memories of the deceased, while others preferred to process their grief privately and quietly. Professional mourners served as translators between these different approaches, helping family members understand that there was no single correct way to mourn and facilitating conversations that might otherwise become sources of conflict or misunderstanding. The social expectations surrounding Victorian mourning could create additional emotional burdens for grieving families.
Widows, for example, faced prescribed mourning periods that could extend for 2 years, 1 year of deep mourning followed by 6 months of half mourning. During the period of deep mourning, widows were expected to wear only black clothing made from dull fabrics like crepe, avoid social gatherings except for church attendance, and maintain an appropriately subdued demeanor in all their interactions.
Professional mourners understood that these social expectations, while intended to provide structure and support for grieving individuals, could sometimes feel oppressive or inappropriate for particular circumstances. A widow who found comfort in social interaction might feel trapped by the expectation that she remain secluded for months.
Conversely, a widow who genuinely needed extended time for private grief might feel pressured by well-meaning friends and relatives who thought she should be getting over it more quickly. The mourners learned to help families navigate these complex social pressures while honoring their authentic emotional needs.
They might suggest subtle modifications to mourning customs that satisfied social expectations while providing more appropriate support for individual grievers.
They understood the fine distinctions between full mourning and half mourning attire, and could help families make transitions between these phases in ways that felt emotionally authentic rather than merely socially prescribed. Children's grief presented particular challenges that required specialized emotional navigation skills from professional mourners.
Victorian attitudes toward childhood mourning were complex. Children were expected to participate in mourning rituals and wear appropriate mourning clothes, but they were also recognized as being developmentally different in their understanding of death and loss. Professional mourners needed to help children express their grief in age-appropriate ways while ensuring they understood the importance of the family's mourning observances.
The mourners often served as emotional interpreters for children who couldn't articulate their feelings or understand the complex social dynamics surrounding them.
A child who seemed to be coping well with a parent's death might suddenly exhibit behavioral problems weeks later when the reality of their loss became more apparent. Professional mourners helped families recognize these delayed emotional responses and provided strategies for supporting children through their unique grieving processes. Religious considerations added another layer of complexity to emotional navigation. Different denominations had varying approaches to grief, death, and mourning, and professional mourners needed to understand how to work within these different theological frameworks. Some families found deep comfort in religious beliefs about afterlife and reunion, while others might be struggling with faith questions that their loss had intensified.
The mourners learned to provide emotional support that was sensitive to these religious dimensions without overstepping their role as spiritual counselors.
They might facilitate conversations between family members and clergy, help families find comfort in religious rituals and readings, or simply provide patient listening when individuals needed to express their spiritual struggles or doubts.
The practical aspects of adjusting to life after loss required ongoing emotional support from professional mourners.
Widows faced the challenge of learning to manage household finances, property decisions, and social relationships that their husbands had previously handled.
Adult children might need to assume new responsibilities for aging parents or younger siblings. These practical adjustments were intimately connected with emotional processing, and professional mourners understood how to provide support that addressed both dimensions simultaneously.
The transition from the intensive social support of the immediate mourning period to the longer-term reality of living with loss required careful emotional navigation. As the stream of visitors diminished and life began to return to more normal patterns, bereaved family members might experience renewed waves of grief or feelings of abandonment. Professional mourners helped families prepare for these transitions and provided strategies for maintaining emotional stability as external support systems naturally diminished. Memory work became an important aspect of emotional navigation during this period. Professional mourners helped families find healthy ways to preserve and honor memories of the deceased without becoming trapped in the past.
This might involve helping families organize personal belongings, create memorial albums or scrapbooks, or establish new traditions that honored the deceased while allowing for continued emotional growth. The mourners also helped families navigate the complex emotions surrounding inheritance and property distribution. These practical matters could trigger intense feelings about fairness, family relationships, and the deceased's intentions or preferences.
Professional mourners provided emotional support during family meetings about these matters, helping individuals express their feelings appropriately while maintaining family relationships. As families moved through the prescribed periods of mourning toward the eventual resumption of normal social life, professional mourners helped them recognize and celebrate small signs of healing and recovery. They understood that moving beyond intense grief was not a betrayal of the deceased, but rather a healthy progression that honored the deceased's memory, while allowing survivors to rebuild meaningful lives. The seasonal rhythms of grief required ongoing attention from professional mourners. Anniversary dates, holidays, and other significant occasions could trigger renewed intensity of mourning even months or years after the initial loss. Professional mourners helped families anticipate these challenges and develop strategies for managing difficult periods while maintaining their overall emotional stability and healing progress.
As the weeks following the funeral stretched into months, a different kind of commerce began to emerge around the Victorian household, not the crude buying and selling of ordinary business,
but rather a sacred economy built around the preservation of memory and the material expressions of continuing love for the deceased. Professional mourners found themselves serving not only as emotional guides, but also as curators of this delicate marketplace of remembrance, helping families navigate the complex world of memorial goods and services while maintaining appropriate dignity and restraint. The Victorian approach to memorial commerce was governed by elaborate social codes that distinguished between appropriate remembrance and price commercialism. Families were expected to invest in certain types of memorial goods and services, but these expenditures needed to be made with careful attention to propriety, family resources, and social expectations. Professional mourners developed expertise in this specialized economy, understanding which memorial purchases would bring lasting comfort to families and which might be viewed as inappropriate or excessive. Mourning jewelry represented one of the most personal and intimate aspects of this memorial economy. These delicate pieces, often incorporating locks of the deceased's hair, photographs, or meaningful inscriptions, allowed grieving family members to carry a physical reminder of their loved one with them throughout their daily lives. Professional mourners helped families work with skilled craftsmen to create these memorial pieces, ensuring that they were both beautiful and emotionally meaningful while maintaining the subtle elegance that Victorian taste demanded. The creation of mourning jewelry required considerable time and artistic skill. Hair from the deceased needed to be carefully preserved and prepared, often woven into intricate patterns or incorporated into lockets, rings, or brooches. Photographs required specialized techniques to be reproduced in the small formats suitable for jewelry. Professional mourners coordinated these complex processes, working with jewelers, photographers, and other craftsmen to ensure that families received memorial pieces that would provide lasting comfort and beauty. Memorial portraiture represented another significant aspect of the remembrance economy.
Victorian families commissioned painted or photographic portraits of their deceased loved ones, often creating elaborate memorial displays in their homes that served as focal points for continuing remembrance and family devotion.
Professional mourners helped families work with artists and photographers to create these memorial images, understanding the subtle differences between portraits that honored the deceased appropriately and those that might seem morbid or inappropriate. The timing of memorial portrait creation required delicate coordination. Some families preferred to commission portraits immediately after death, while the deceased's appearance was still natural and peaceful. Others found this too emotionally difficult and preferred to wait until their initial grief had softened somewhat. Professional mourners helped families make these decisions based on their emotional readiness and practical circumstances, ensuring that the memorial portraits were created under conditions that would result in beautiful and comforting final images. Memorial cards and commemorative stationery formed another important component of the Victorian remembrance economy. These elaborate printed materials served both practical and symbolic functions, allowing families to acknowledge condolences, share information about memorial services, and provide friends and relatives with lasting keepsakes that honored the deceased memory. Professional mourners worked with printers and stationers to ensure that these materials reflected appropriate taste and sentiment while communicating necessary practical information. The language used on memorial cards and stationery required careful consideration, and often input from professional mourners who understood the subtle conventions of Victorian mourning communication. Biblical verses, poetry excerpts, and personal messages needed to strike the right balance between genuine sentiment and social appropriateness. Professional mourners helped families choose language that would comfort recipients while honoring the memory of the deceased in ways that reflected both personal feeling and cultural expectations. Grave monuments and cemetery memorials represented the most visible and permanent aspects of the Victorian remembrance economy. These elaborate stone markers ranged from simple headstones to complex sculptural installations that could cost more than many families spent on their homes. Professional mourners helped families navigate the complex world of monument design and construction, understanding both the artistic possibilities and the practical considerations involved in creating lasting memorial tributes. The symbolism incorporated into Victorian grave monuments was rich and complex, with different motifs conveying specific messages about the deceased's character, faith, and relationships. Professional mourners needed to understand this symbolic language and help families choose memorial elements that accurately reflected their loved one's life and their family's values. Angels might represent spiritual guidance or protection. Flowers could symbolize the beauty and brevity of life, and religious symbols conveyed faith and hope for eternal reunion. The maintenance of grave sites created ongoing economic relationships that could extend for decades after the initial burial. Professional mourners often helped families establish arrangements for regular grave maintenance, seasonal flower plantings, and periodic monument cleaning or repair. These ongoing expenses needed to be planned for carefully, particularly by families of modest means who wanted to ensure that their memorial investments would be properly maintained over time. Memorial gardens and home shrines represented more private aspects of the remembrance economy. Many Victorian families created elaborate memorial displays within their homes, incorporating photographs, personal belongings, flowers, and religious or symbolic objects into carefully arranged shrines that served as focal points for family devotion and remembrance. Professional mourners helped families design these memorial spaces, understanding how to create displays that were both beautiful and emotionally supportive without becoming overwhelming or morbid. The seasonal rhythms of memorial commerce required ongoing attention from professional mourners. Anniversary dates, birthdays, and holidays created opportunities for renewed memorial expression, special flowers for the gravesite, new additions to home memorial displays, or memorial gifts exchanged among family members. Professional mourners helped families plan for these seasonal observances, ensuring that they had appropriate materials and arrangements in place for meaningful commemoration. The economics of extended mourning could place significant financial strain on families, particularly those of modest means who felt pressure to maintain expensive mourning customs for extended periods. Professional mourners understood these financial realities and helped families find ways to observe appropriate mourning traditions without creating unsustainable economic burdens.
They might suggest less expensive alternatives to traditional mourning goods, help families prioritize their memorial expenditures, or connect them with charitable organizations that provided assistance for mourning families. Charitable aspects of the memorial economy provided opportunities for families to honor their deceased loved ones through giving and service, rather than purely material commemorations. Professional mourners helped families identify appropriate charitable causes that reflected the deceased's interests or values, plan memorial donations or endowments, and organize service projects that could involve extended family members and friends in meaningful commemorative activities. The gradual transition from intensive memorial commerce to more sustainable long-term remembrance practices required careful guidance from professional mourners. Families needed to move from the expensive and elaborate memorial activities of the immediate mourning period toward more modest but meaningful ongoing commemoration that could be maintained indefinitely without financial hardship or emotional exhaustion. Professional mourners helped families establish annual or periodic memorial traditions that honored their loved one's memory without requiring constant expense or elaborate preparation. These might include annual cemetery visits, memorial donations on significant dates, or family gatherings that combined remembrance with celebration of continuing family life and relationships. The legacy aspects of memorial commerce extended beyond immediate family needs to consider how memorial investments would affect future generations. Professional mourners helped families think about which memorial objects and practices would provide lasting value to children, grandchildren, and future family members, ensuring that their memorial investments would continue to serve meaningful purposes long after the immediate grief had evolved into gentler forms of ongoing remembrance. Quality considerations in memorial purchases required expertise that professional mourners developed through years of experience with different craftsmen, suppliers, and service providers. They learned to distinguish between memorial goods that would provide lasting beauty and satisfaction, and those that might deteriorate quickly or fail to meet families' long-term needs. This expertise helped families make memorial investments that would honor their deceased loved ones appropriately while providing good value for their financial resources. As the seasons turned and the immediate intensity of Victorian mourning gradually softened into the gentler rhythms of ongoing remembrance, professional mourners found their role evolving from crisis management to something more akin to spiritual gardening, the careful tending of memory and meaning that would sustain families through the years and decades that stretched ahead. This was perhaps the most profound aspect of their profession, requiring not just social skill and emotional intelligence, but a deep understanding of how human hearts learn to carry love beyond the boundary of death. The transition from formal mourning periods to the lifetime work of remembrance was rarely smooth or predictable. Professional mourners understood that grief followed no neat timeline, that healing was not a destination, but rather an ongoing process of learning to live with loss while remaining open to beauty, meaning, and new forms of love. They had observed countless families navigate this transition, and they had developed sophisticated strategies for supporting people through the delicate work of building new lives that honored the past while embracing the future. The first anniversary of death represented a particularly significant milestone in this journey. Victorian customs included elaborate traditions around first anniversary observances, with families returning to cemeteries for memorial services, hosting remembrance gatherings, or commissioning new memorial objects to mark the completion of the first year of mourning. Professional mourners helped families plan these anniversary observances, understanding that they served important psychological functions in helping mourners recognize their own survival and growth while maintaining connections to their deceased loved ones. These anniversary preparations often triggered renewed waves of grief that could surprise families who thought they had successfully navigated the worst of their loss.
Professional mourners anticipated these anniversary reactions and helped families prepare emotionally for the intensity that significant dates could bring.
They understood that recognizing the continuing power of grief was not a sign of failure or weakness, but rather evidence of the depth and authenticity of the love that had been shared.
The seasonal cycles of Victorian life created natural rhythms for remembrance that professional mourners helped families incorporate into their ongoing memorial practices.
Spring brought opportunities for grave site beautification and the planting of memorial gardens.
Summer allowed for extended family gatherings that could include visits to cemeteries or memorial sites.
Autumn harvest seasons provided occasions for charitable giving in memory of the deceased.
Winter's quiet months offered opportunities for more intimate, indoor memorial activities like organizing family papers or creating memorial albums. Professional mourners understood that these seasonal observances needed to be meaningful rather than merely dutiful.
They helped families discover which memorial activities brought genuine comfort and connection, and which had become empty rituals that drained energy without providing spiritual nourishment.
This required ongoing assessment and adjustment as families' needs and circumstances changed over time. The integration of memorial practices with ongoing family life presented ongoing challenges that professional mourners helped address.
Children grew and developed new understandings of death and loss, requiring adjustments in how memorial traditions were explained and maintained. Family finances might change, necessitating modifications in expensive memorial customs.
New family members through marriage or birth required inclusion in memorial traditions in ways that honored the deceased while making newcomers feel welcome rather than excluded.
Professional mourners served as bridges between different generations within families, helping older relatives share their memories and memorial traditions with younger family members who might not have known the deceased well or who had different attitudes toward death and remembrance.
These intergenerational connections were crucial for maintaining family continuity and ensuring that memorial traditions remained living practices rather than museum pieces. The evolution of memorial technologies during the Victorian era provided new opportunities for remembrance that professional mourners helped families explore and adopt. Improvements in photography made it possible to create more affordable and durable memorial portraits.
Advances in printing technology allowed for more elaborate memorial cards and commemorative publications.
New transportation systems made cemetery visits more accessible and memorial gatherings more feasible for extended family members. Professional mourners needed to stay current with these technological developments while helping families maintain appropriate traditional elements in their memorial practices.
They served as consultants helping families blend innovation with established customs in ways that enhanced rather than replaced meaningful memorial traditions. Religious dimensions of long-term remembrance required ongoing attention for professional mourners who understood that people's spiritual needs and beliefs could evolve significantly in response to loss.
Some families found their faith strengthened by their experience of grief and sought to deepen their religious memorial practices. Others might struggle with spiritual questions that grief had raised, requiring more secular approaches to remembrance and meaning-making. Professional mourners learned to work sensitively with these evolving spiritual needs, helping families find remembrance practices that reflected their current beliefs while remaining open to future spiritual growth or change.
They understood that authentic memorial practices needed to match families' genuine spiritual convictions rather than simply following prescribed religious forms.
The social aspects of long-term remembrance created ongoing opportunities and challenges for families in mourning. Victorian society expected certain memorial observances to continue indefinitely, but the intensity of social support that surrounded immediate mourning naturally diminished as time passed. Professional mourners helped families transition from community-supported mourning to more independent memorial practices that could be sustained without constant external validation or assistance. This transition required families to develop internal sources of meaning and motivation for their memorial practices. Professional mourners helped families identify which remembrance activities brought genuine personal satisfaction and spiritual nourishment, distinguishing these from activities that were performed primarily to meet social expectations.
This process of discernment was crucial for developing sustainable long-term memorial practices.
The geographical mobility that characterized increasingly modern Victorian society created challenges for maintaining memorial practices centered around specific locations like grave sites or family homes. Professional mourners helped families develop portable memorial traditions that could be maintained even when circumstances required relocation.
These might include memorial objects that could be easily transported, memorial practices that didn't require specific locations, or correspondence networks that maintained family memorial traditions across distances.
Economic considerations in long-term memorial practices required ongoing attention from professional mourners who understood that families' financial circumstances could change significantly over time.
Memorial practices that seemed affordable during the immediate aftermath of loss might become unsustainable during economic difficulties. Conversely, families might find themselves able to afford more elaborate memorial expressions as their financial situations improved.
Professional mourners helped families develop flexible memorial practices that could be adjusted according to changing circumstances without losing their essential meaning or emotional value.
They understood that the most sustainable memorial traditions were those that emphasized meaning and connection rather than expense or elaboration. The eventual integration of loss into the broader narrative of family life represented the ultimate goal of Victorian memorial practices.
Professional mourners understood that successful mourning was not about forgetting or getting over loss, but rather about learning to carry love and memory in ways that enriched rather than diminished ongoing life.
They helped families recognize signs of this integration and celebrate their growth while maintaining appropriate reverence for their deceased loved ones.
The legacy work that professional mourners facilitated extended beyond individual families to contribute to the broader Victorian culture of remembrance.
They helped preserve memorial traditions that might otherwise be lost, documented family histories that future generations would treasure, and maintained community networks of support that could assist other mourning families.
Their work contributed to the rich Victorian tradition of honouring death and loss as integral aspects of meaningful human life.
As twilight settled over the Victorian household, and the professional mourners completed their final tasks, they could take satisfaction in knowing that they had helped families navigate one of life's most challenging passages with dignity, grace, and authentic feeling. Their work had honored both the deceased and the living, maintaining the delicate balance between remembrance and renewal that allowed communities to survive loss while preserving the love and wisdom that death could not destroy.
The gentle art of professional mourning represented something precious in human civilization, the recognition that loss deserves careful attention, that grief requires skilled support, and that the transition from life to death is too significant to be faced without the assistance of those who have dedicated themselves to understanding its mysteries. In our modern rush through life and death, perhaps there is wisdom to be found in these Victorian rhythms of careful attention, patient support, and reverent remembrance.
And so we conclude our quiet journey through the world of Victorian mourning customs and the remarkable profession of the funeral mourner.
As you rest tonight, perhaps you might carry with you some appreciation for these dedicated individuals who understood that grief, like love, deserves to be honored with patience, skill, and gentle care. Thank you for joining me at the Sleep Library. Rest well, and remember that even in our modern world, the ancient human needs for comfort, community, and respectful remembrance remain as constant as the turning of the seasons.